Welcome to Short Movie Channel. At the beginning of our film today, we see a plane traveling to a city in Russia. Among the passengers, we notice a mother with her daughter, Katya, who is 7 years old. While in the air, the plane's engine malfunctions, and then Katya wakes up to find that her mother has disappeared from beside her. The plane announces that they will have to make an emergency landing. As the plane begins to lose control, Katya notices an elderly woman sitting behind her, muttering strange words, which scares her. In that moment, the engine of the plane explodes, causing the crash, but Katya manages to survive and ends up walking alone, with a broken leg, in the forest. 20 years later, we see a group of journalists heading to meet Katya for an interview about the 20th anniversary of the famous crash. Katya is with her daughter, Diana, who is now 7 years old. During the interview, Katya shares that she has moved past the trauma and no longer wants to think about that day. She explains that her experience with the trauma led her to become a psychologist so she could help others cope with their mental health issues. During the interview, Diana interrupts and tells the journalists that her mother still gets affected when she hears the sound of braces clicking because it reminds her of her childhood and what she went through. She adds that her mother no longer fears flying, which is why they're planning to travel soon to visit her grandfather. One day, Katya and Diana book a flight for the evening, and the number of passengers is low because many people change their plans due to bad weather. As they board the plane, Diana tells Katya that she wants to sit in the very last row, but Katya refuses, explaining that those seats aren't for them. Before the plane takes off, they meet a man named Alexei, who is sitting next to them. When Alexei notices Katya's tension, he reassures her that everything will be fine. After a while, Katya notices that there's a problem with the passengers in the very back of the plane, and an elderly woman named Galina seems to be having a panic attack. As a psychologist, Katya goes to help her, speaks to her about her fear, and gives her a calming pill. In the front of the plane, we see a businessman named Nikolai looking around. He notices a young man sitting across from him, drawing something. He asks the young man what he's drawing, and the young man replies vaguely, saying that drawing helps him see. As the plane takes off, Katya begins to hear strange sounds coming from above, which increases her anxiety. She heads to the bathroom to take her anxiety medication, ignoring the flight attendant's warnings to stay in her seat. While the flight attendants are giving safety instructions, Katya suddenly hears her mother's voice and notices that the bathroom door looks completely different. When she opens it, she finds herself in the house where she grew up as a child. She moves toward the second door, but suddenly, she wakes up back on the plane. Finally, the plane takes off, and once they're in the air, Katya apologizes to Alexei for her rude behavior earlier. They chat for a bit, and Alexei tells her that he's a journalist who's traveled to conflict zones around the world to cover events and deliver the news. After a while, everyone falls asleep, and the plane continues to fly through the storm. Suddenly, the sky turns red, and we see strange hands appear at the windows of the plane. In the scene that follows, we see Katya as a child, sitting down to dinner with her mother at their house. When she asks if the scar on her leg will go away soon, her mother tells her that the scar may stay with her for the rest of her life. After a while, Katya gets scared when she sees her mother's reflection in the mirror and realizes something is wrong. Katya asks her mother if she died in the accident, but her mother gets upset and tells her to stop asking such questions, as it's been 3 months since the accident. When her mom goes to wash the dishes, Katya starts hearing the sound of increasing turbulence. Then, her mother begins to move strangely, and thankfully, Katya wakes up and finds out it was just a nightmare. She wakes up to the sound of turbulence on the plane, and the turbulence continues for a while. Galen's husband, named AF, suddenly loses consciousness, causing the other passengers and flight attendants to rush to help him. Since Katya is trained in first aid and has experience with situations like this, she tells them exactly what to do. They lay the man on the floor so she can perform CPR, but at that moment, he wakes up and starts choking Katya, whispering strange things. Afterward, he passes out again. Worse still, the turbulence intensifies as time goes on. Katya freezes when she sees a black hand gripping the seat behind her. Everything stops. Galen's husband dies, and suddenly, the plane goes through a severe turbulence that throws the passengers around, causing the flight attendants to run to grab the emergency oxygen mask. The turbulence causes the attendant to fall to the ceiling, and the oxygen mask slips from her hand. Meanwhile, Katya begins to lose consciousness due to the lack of oxygen. She recalls an elderly woman who was sitting behind her on the old plane that crashed. When she wakes up, the turbulence stops, and she rushes to Diana, who is terrified and tells her she won't leave her alone again. Afterward, Katya tells Alexei about the elderly woman she saw on the plane 20 years ago, and how she feels that the woman is behind everything, especially since the strange words AF whispered to her were exactly the same as the mumblings the elderly woman used to say. Katya assumes that the old woman is upset because she's the only one who survived the crash and wants Katya to die too. However, Alexei tells her that the man died naturally and that she's probably hallucinating because of the pills she took. Katya goes to comfort the grieving Galen about her husband's death. When she returns to Diana, she finds her drawing a picture of a plane while sitting in the back seats. Katya tells her that those seats are not theirs, and they return to their original seats. Katya then tells Alexei that she heard her mother's voice before the plane took off and feels like her mother is trying to warn her about something. Meanwhile, in the front rows, Nikolai, a businessman, tries to talk to the strange young man again and tells him he's been traveling for a week, just wanting to return to his family. He shows him a picture of his kids on his phone, but the young man continues his strange behavior. Later, we find out that he's drawing a picture of Nikolai as he's getting fat. Katya remains convinced that something is wrong. She tells Alexei that the scar on her leg disappeared, even though she saw it that morning. She also mentions that the situation is strange because one of the passengers died, and they haven't heard anything about the plane until now. Suddenly, her head starts to hurt. Diana, who's sitting behind her, is talking to someone. When Katya looks back, she sees no one, and Diana tells her she was talking to a little girl, who said she would leave her once the light turned on. The strange thing is, the flight attendant announces that due to the storm, they'll land in Sparesk, the same city Katya had visited with her mother 20 years ago. Katya notices something strange about the flight attendant's behavior, as she's acting distant. After a while, we discover that the oxygen mask the attendant dropped earlier is leaking gas under Nikolai's seat, and there's another strange leak coming from the ceiling. Diana tells Katya that the little girl said she'd leave her now. At that moment, Nikolai pulls out a cigarette and is about to light it. Katya notices and runs to stop him, but it's too late. He lights the cigarette, and the gas ignites, making the fire even worse. The oxygen mask under the seat increases the fire, and miraculously, Katya sees someone in front of her, moving toward her. The flight attendants bring fire extinguishers and put out the fire. Nikolai survives but suffers serious burns. As the flight attendants try to help him, Katya returns to Diana, but then she suddenly finds herself back at home with her daughter, the day before the flight. She is still holding her daughter, and she suggests they cancel tomorrow's flight. The little girl agrees. At night, Katya keeps saying she won't take the pill again. She throws it in the bathroom and then hears the sound of her daughter, but she can't find her in front of her. Suddenly, the house starts shaking violently, and Diana screams at Katya because she keeps leaving her. After that, Katya finds herself on the plane again, and it's the one that makes her wake up. Diana runs to her and tells her she passed by her without noticing her. Katya asks her to forgive her for her actions, and then Alex gives them help. He tells Katya that they need her to help save Nikolai, who is burned. After Katya looks at the poor man, she realizes his airway is blocked, so she teaches Alex how to hold his head to help him breathe. While she's getting the first aid kit, Alex asks her what's going on. It's honestly mixed with nightmares. On the other hand, the strange young man is still sitting, muttering strange things to himself. This causes Katya's nerves to break, and she yells at him, but Alex stops her. At that moment, Nikolai is trying to reach his phone. The strange young man stands up to help him, and shows him a picture of himself happily with his family on his phone. After Nikolai sees his family for the last time, he takes a final breath and dies. Now they lose again, and the plane continues. Katya apologizes to the strange young man for what she did. He finally introduces himself, saying his name is Pavel. After a while, Katya notices that Galina is no longer where she was and has been in the bathroom for a long time. She gets scared for her and goes to check on her. She knocks on the door, and the flight attendants are confused, thinking Katya is mentally ill and needs to be restrained. When they finally open the bathroom door, they don't find Galina inside. At that moment, her son's body wakes up and opens his eyes. When Katya returns to her seat, she notices she's sitting in seat number 19. When she wakes up and returns to reality, she finds things exactly as they were. She sees a dark figure that seems to want to say something to her. Katya runs to her daughter and tells her they need to get off the plane immediately. When she says, "Leave," Alex tries to stop her, but his eye starts bleeding suddenly, and he loses consciousness. The flight attendants run to them, also trying to stop Katya from leaving the plane. But suddenly, one of the attendants vomits water until she collapses and dies. When Katya witnesses this, she blames the other flight attendant for what happened. She then goes to Pavel, snatches his drawing pad from his hands, and finds that he's been drawing all the nightmares he's seen. As soon as she sees the drawing of the plane's exit, it turns into pieces and disappears into the air. The flight attendant, Alexei, tries to convince Katya not to enter the cockpit and tells her they are trying to protect her from something. But at that moment, the attendant is pulled away by an unseen force, and Alexei starts bleeding from his head until he falls and dies in front of her. With no other option, Katya opens the plane door and finds another cabin, similar to the one she came from. But she doesn't lose hope and keeps walking, entering one cabin after another until she finds herself in a different plane cabin. Suddenly, Diana disappears from her side and appears at the end of the aisle with the dark figure. Katya runs toward her, but at that moment, the movie's events change. We discover that all of this wasn't real, and Katya is still on the plane that will crash 20 years later. The old woman, who she thought was the cause of all of this, tells her she should rest so that the little girl doesn't see how horrific death is. All the visions she had were just glimpses of a future that wasn't meant to happen. Since she kept trying to wake up and prove she didn't want to die, the old woman releases Katya from her spell. Now Katya's fate is in her hands. Then, we return to the past and see the people on the plane. They are the same people who were with Katya in her future vision. Diana and her husband are sitting a few rows behind, and when he has a heart attack, Katya goes to help him. While Katya is asleep, she returns to Hala and her mother one last time to say goodbye to her imaginary daughter Diana. Diana tells her to pay attention to the little details she saw in her hallucinations to save herself. When Katya finally wakes up, we go back to the time when the plane starts to crash, just like we saw at the beginning of the movie. Katya crawls to the back seats and reaches her mother, barely making it. In this terrifying moment, Katya sees the rest of the passengers on the plane dying one by one, just like they died in her hallucinations. Alex helps her and secures them in the back seats, fastening their seat belts. Before he can save himself, he dies in the explosion. The movie ends after the plane crashes, and Katya and her mother survive, finding themselves sitting in seat number 19. And that's how it ends. If you like the movie, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.